So welcome back, everybody. We have a great tutorial for you from Arturo Deza in Perceptual Invariances in Humans and Machines. Just really quickly, Arturo is currently a postdoc in the Poggio lab with us at the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines at MIT. He was previously a postdoc with Talia Konkel over at Harvard University and completed his PhD at UCSB. So Arturo, take it away.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Chris, and very honored to be here sharing some work and trying to, to teach a bit of perceptual invariance as well as part of the tutorial series. So I know it's a Friday, it's the end of 2 weeks, and I know everyone is both very excited and perhaps a bit exhausted as well. So I'm going to try to make this hopefully as dynamic as possible, and please feel free to ask questions on the Q&A and the chat, and in case anything isn't clear. So I think this talk also is going to follow up in a great way from Josh's talk, because I'm going to be focusing mainly on vision, but I'm going to be speaking a lot about the concept of metamerism as well. That I feel at the end of the session there were a lot of unanswered questions. So hopefully, in the spirit of a good tutorial, I can try to answer some of these questions, as metamerism is related to perceptual invariance in a way. Okay, so I'm going to kind of take a step back and go with this maybe cliche-like slide that at this point in the summer school almost everyone has seen or heard about, and it has to do with the analogy of studying or approaching vision as the example of flight, right? That if you want to mimic flight and you study the birds and it's like flapping wing mechanic, maybe you might say that, to make a mechanical device that flies, we need essentially flapping wings, right? And that's kind of not really the whole story, even though it seems somewhat true that most biological organisms, even insects that fly, do have wings. But interestingly enough, the way humanity has progressed in history, we came up with another set of, say, rules or ways in which we could achieve flight in artificial organisms that, in not all cases, like the Zeppelin, uses its wings in the same way, right? The Zeppelin achieves flight mainly due to lift forces and kind of playing with the density of air and the vessel in itself. This bomber is in itself a wing, which is quite peculiar, and this helicopter uses 2 sets of rotors to essentially produce vertical lift and horizontal stabilization. I think it's either called yaw or pitch. The people who know about aeronautics would probably know that better. But this is an idea and a concept that comes all the way back from Marr in '82, and really some kind of key concept I want to play around with in the hour of this tutorial is, when thinking about, and this is an idea borrowed from Bill Freeman's great talk at SVRHM last year at NeurIPS, is for computations in AI, in vision, in language. I'm just going to focus on vision. But in almost anything, when we approach a problem, are we thinking about a specific computation as feathers or as wings, right? If you put wings on a human, the human can actually fly in this kind of cartoon-like depiction of things. But if you put feathers on a human, then the feathers don't fly. Sorry, the human doesn't really fly, right? It's just kind of like in a chicken outfit, and it'll try to flap its wings, but it won't do anything. So here the story kind of goes like this, right? There's essentially a set of, say, canonical computations that we've seen that have been successfully implemented and borrowed from what we observed in the ventral stream, all the way from light falling to the retina, and kind of all the series of operations that happen through the LGN and V1, V2, all the way up to IT. And in the grand scheme of things, these operations have to do with stuff such as convolution or filtering, half-wave rectification, pooling, and to a certain degree, we've approximated them with certain success in mainly convolutional neural networks, and well, there's different now, a myriad of different flavors of deep networks, and yet just with CNNs, at a very rough level, we can do simple stuff such as object recognition, or in this case, kind of knowing that this is a cat, right? That's quite surprising. So going back to the analogy of feathers versus wings, right? If I argue, this is a debatable statement, is convolution or is filtering feathers or wings? In other words, is convolution or filtering something that is a necessary computation that without this, you just cannot achieve high-level robust vision analogous to flight? I think if we were to do a polling, I have a special polling for you guys in a bit. Everyone would agree that convolution is wings. Although, for the people who've been reading a lot about theoretical machine learning progress and advances, there was a paper about 2 or 3 weeks ago by Nisha Boer saying that fully connected networks is all you need, and if you essentially emphasize learning with a lasso regularizer, you can kind of learn the convolution even if you don't impose locality in the structure of learning in a network. So again, debatable statement, but I think if we were to run the poll and in the benefit of time and the audience and other constraints, I think everyone would say convolution is necessary to achieve high level and robust vision. Again, you can ask this at the end of the talk and we can discuss about that later. Half-wave rectification and nonlinearities. I think, you know, most of you who have probably taken a intro to deep learning class know that if you essentially just stack a bunch of layers without any nonlinearities whatsoever, then it's just as having a single linear layer, right? It's if you have n linear layers stacked, it's the same thing as just having one. So unless you have some sort of nonlinearity of or half-wave rectification, as happens in real neurons to one extent or another, this doesn't have to necessarily be ReLU or, you know, or hyperbolic tangent or whatever. Again, if I would run this poll, I think many people would say, yes, we do need nonlinearities for high-level robust vision. Pooling, again, I think everyone would also agree and say, yes, they are in effect some sort of nonlinearity. So, but I have a more interesting one that I'm going to talk about, also related to the theme of the tutorial, which is foveation. And foveation is pretty peculiar because every time you hear or, well, read, somewhat ironically, about this, it kind of doesn't really make sense that you would want to have a spatially varying sensor one way or another. Most of the fans in computer vision and most of the leading figures, including Jan LeCun, when I've had conversations with him, he would, mainly the arguments would be, Arturo, why would you want to compress information in the periphery? I think that is useless, so you want Phobia everywhere. And Jan, I agree. So he might actually see the recording at some point. So he knows me, that's okay, hopefully. And, you know, it's a tricky thing because, you know, it doesn't really, you would think about it kind of in Jan's perspective and many other people in computer vision, and like, why would you want to throw away information, right? But on the flip side, you know, humans, we do have this spatially varying field of view. So why is it the case? Do you want to be efficient in terms of spatial sampling? Is it the same as having a high resolution phobia everywhere, but the fact that we can make eye movements makes the performance asymptotic? So that's where I'm going to try to poll the audience and see where everyone is. Usually the audience is, I'm going to bias you guys with the prior, is half split, but maybe not, or maybe yes. So let's run the poll. So I'm going to launch the poll and you guys should see this. Foveation, is it feathers or wings? And you have to essentially cast your vote. I don't know if you guys can see this. Okay, votes are coming in. And all right, cool. They're coming in. They're coming in. I got 10 votes, 20, 30. Or so as I entertain the audience for a bit, those of you who know Jürgen Schmidhuber, he would say, we have a third group of people who did not understand the question, for those who are a bit shy about voting, but I think you should vote even if you're not sure. Okay, so I'm gonna give you guys just a couple more seconds. We have about 60 votes in. Maybe 5 more seconds. There is, I think, hopefully no right or wrong answer. I'm actually just kind of curious. So 1, 2, and 3, okay, 69 and 2. So 2/3 of people, actually Jürgen was right. 2/3 of people voted. Okay, so the other third who is in between, let's see what the 2/3 of people actually voted for. So can you guys see it? Okay, share results. So essentially, hopefully you guys can see the results, and it says, for those who can't, I'm just going to share it, pop it up real quick. It's half split pretty much. So 50% of the 60% who voted said feathers. So it's pretty much, you know, useless, nice thing to have, but, you know, maybe not really necessary. And another 50%, somewhat surprisingly and marginally winning by a bit, actually thinks it's wings and it's necessary for higher level of vision. Higher level of vision mean potentially, you know, robustness to adversarial examples, having, you know, our grand, how do you say this? Theory of vision that one day, you know, we could mimic vision just as well as humans or maybe even better, or whatever that means, if that's even possible. So, okay, so that's it. Stop sharing results. So before I continue, for those who voted wings, so who said it's useful, I'm going to try to see if maybe within the scope of perceptual invariance 2 and tying this to foveation, if the way or the angle I'm going to tackle this problem is relevant, and maybe you guys find it also aligned with what you were thinking, and maybe not, and maybe I'll present another type of direction or angle or approach to foveation as wings. And for those who voted foveation as feathers, hopefully during the talk, the goal here isn't really to to change your mind and say that someone is right or wrong. It's more because I think this is still kind of an open question in science to a certain degree, but to see if I can kind of cast some doubt on why you thought foveation was wings, and maybe there's another potential reason. Sorry, feathers, and maybe why there's another potential reason it should be wings. So let's get started with the first part of the talk, or almost preamble to the first part of the talk. There's arguments about efficiency versus functionality. So I think I kind of already went very quickly through the efficiency argument that has to do with, if you compress information in the periphery, you can still kind of see what's going on in the fovea, especially for scene recognition. So, at this point, I don't really care. I still know what the scene is. I can recognize the percept, right? Even if it's blurry. So at the end of the day, I'm probably still having the same accuracy. Now, the other argument has to do with functionality, or maybe foveation is buying you something at the representational level, right? And here, before I get into the detail of this specific transform, I'm going to kind of present this, say, illustrative cartoon of why maybe foveation could buy you a greater level of perceptual invariance, whatever that may mean. So when you see something like this object, and let's step aside from scene recognition for a bit. When you foveate or fixate at the object, you're placing your center of gaze at the object, and pretty much everything is high resolution. You can tell what it is. It's a pair of sunglasses. Now, interestingly enough, when you move your eyes outside of the boundary or the contour of the object, it's not your fovea isn't on the object itself, but somehow you can still make sense of what the object percept is. So even if it's in the periphery, you can still detect what the object is, and it seems either distorted, scrambled, or blurred. You can't really tell what the percept is, but you can kind of guess with the shape that it's still the same object, right? The same for, say, a cup or a glass of water or a coffee mug, right? No matter your point of fixation, you can kind of still tell what it is. Interestingly enough, for a machine, if you move the object around the screen or the display, you're not sampling a new data point, if you think about it, right? Because CNNs or the translation invariance. So it's like you're sampling the same point over and over again. However, if you were to have, for example, in this illustrative cartoon or whatever, a spatially varying or foveated field of view, and you sample the space and try to decipher what this object is, you would essentially be encoding something that looks like a distribution of what that object is. So that's kind of the, how would you say this, the motivation for maybe thinking that foveation is useful at the representational level. And before also we go further on this, there's a bit of interesting plot twist in what I'm going to talk about, which is that we're going to implement foveation not like this, which is essentially adaptive Gaussian blurring as a function of retinal eccentricity, but foveation as a texture-based transform that mimics the effects of visual crowding. And this, again, also at some point, and maybe in the next 15 minutes or so, there's going to be some link to this and the concept of visual metamerism and perceptual invariance, okay? So actually, I'm going to go to the punchline a bit. I'm skipping 40 slides in the future. If we were to do a psychophysical experiment and I were to flip between these two images, you probably wouldn't tell the difference, but you also probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference if I would flip between these two under certain viewing conditions, such as viewing distance from the display, amount of display time, and so forth, if I'm doing some sort of backwards masking as well. So how are we going to test the hypothesis that, say, foveation and also somewhat linked to perceptual invariance is useful at all, or say for a deep net, right? And does it buy you something for any model organism that can learn how to use a representation? we're going to call or define what we're going to call foveated perceptual systems, which are essentially two-stage, where they're going to receive an input like a scene. They're going to foveate at the center of the image. So they're going to fix it at the image. They're going to do this foveation texture-based transform on the image. So like distort it in the periphery and preserve everything in the fovea. And then we're going to run this through a CNN, and the perceptual system should ideally be able to learn what scene this is. So it's going to be trained on doing scene classification. See, there's some questions. I'll answer them just in a bit before I go to the first part. So that's a good thing. Cool. The control for this is doing standard net, which is essentially a model system that has the same pipeline as this first one that is foveated, except that it's just non-foveated at all. We're going to send this through like a null transform where we're really just matching the same type of compression mechanism between the top and bottom procedure, so that there's no sort of say potential differences due to artifacts or whatever that may mean. And then see if the system that doesn't learn how to see with a fovea or with a spatially varying sensor can do better or worse or about the same as the one that is foveated. And then we're going to have two more conditions where in lieu of or in spirit of data augmentation, which has been a huge trend, and everyone in computer vision says, augment your data, put noise, put jitter, put rotations, put color, flip the image forwards and backwards, or crop it. Those are all artificial mechanisms of data augmentation that it's perfectly valid to do in machines, and we're going to call this the standard augment. And mainly for that, it's just cropping and then applying a horizontal mirroring on a subset of the image and then resizing it back to its original input size. And then for the Foveation augment, so essentially this is just this same stage somewhere in the middle, okay? It's the same pipeline, but I just want to emphasize this middle transform stage. For the Foveation augment, we're going to add eye movements. That's going to be our biological proxy for data augmentation. So essentially augmented versions and non-augmented versions. And we're just going to see what happens, see what emerges in the deep net, naive to whatever possible things or how do you say this, results that have occurred or happened in vision science, and just see what happens. So that's perceptual evaluation network. And that's going to be the first part of the talk, talking about how do you do this transform, and it's linked really to perceptual invariance, talking about metamerism and walking you guys through that. And the second part is really about checking in on the different types of emergent representation. So I just saw some questions. I'm going to answer them now, just before I start. So, okay. Atanas Stankov asks, interesting question. What do you think about having two networks running in parallel, one for the fovea and one for peripheral vision, and later combining their outputs with an attention module and a higher perceptual network to build an active vision matching that can do rapid scene perception, so a machine that can saccade. So having a machine that can learn, I'm going to kind of answer the question in reverse order. Having a machine that can learn how to make fixations or eye movements is very interesting. I think that's kind of like probably one of the holy grails of computer vision, and somewhat also related to vision science too, because if you can make a predictive model that can mimic eye movements the same way a human would do it, then that's amazing, right? But that's not the goal of this specific, project or evaluation scheme. Here, the main goal is, first, does a foveated transform buy you anything? Yes or no? And second of all, if we had a proxy for eye movements, that in this case, they're not intelligently sampled, they're just sampled by a 3x3 grid. Does eye movements buy you anything in scene perception when coupled with a foveated transform? So that I think halfway through answers the second part of the question. For the first bit, I agree, having a machine that will learn the saccades would be great. For the first part of your question, for having two parallel streams, I think, yeah, that would be pretty interesting. There's been other folks that have done that. Wang and Cottrell have explored that option, just as well as Wu Wu and Kramen. So actually a reviewer in our NeurIPS paper said that, Arturo, why didn't you do this? Strong reject. And I'm like, oh, right in the feels, I feel you and I see you. But one of the reasons why we didn't do that is because, well, you could argue, even though we don't want to model the human visual system, is, the cortical sheet is kind of like a continuum, and there's no kind of, how would you say this, explicit boundary between the foveal area and the peripheral area. Although I think it would be definitely pretty cool to see if you force a difference in learning between the foveal regions and the periphery. And actually, this is what Wang and Cottrell did, but with a Gaussian blur transform, and they found that, not surprisingly enough, and this matches results in vision science, that the deep net that's been trained in the peripheral region is more sensitive to low pass frequency, and the deep net that's been trained in the foveal region is more sensitive to high pass frequency. So what we want to do is just do something where it's like just kind of even more naive, right? Just like Foveation transform, put that in a deep net, have AlexNet or ResNet, and the results I'm going to show in the future are going to be for any one of these two networks. And just let's just see what happens. Does it buy you something in terms of robustness, in terms of generalization, in terms of perceptual sensitivity or biases? I still think the dual or the bifurcating approach, the dual streamer bifurcating approach is very reasonable and valid and worth exploring. And it has yielded very positive results, actually. So it's a very good question. Not the theme of this part, but very, very interesting approach as well, and completely valid too. Okay, so first part of the talk is this transform, and you know, how do we do this, and what does this mean, and what is a link to a foveated image that looks blurred in this textured way versus an image that is using adaptive Gaussian blurring as a function of retinal eccentricity. So I'm going to walk you guys through this, and that's the first part of the talk, you know, like the Tarantino movie, part one, and some clues on how this is related to perceptual invariance. So this is the classic example from Friedman and Simoncelli, 2011. Great influence in my work, and also in Josh's work. In fact, Josh was a postdoc with Aero. And if I walk you guys through this example of fixating at the center of the screen of this orange dot, you know, we're like, okay, yeah, this is an image of a scene. We get that, nothing interesting or funny going on. So, you know, just hold fixation at the center of the screen at the orange dot. And I'm going to flip back and forth between two images, and you should ideally not be able to see the difference. And you know, if you actually break fixation and look at this red region, the image has been distorted or warped in a certain way. It almost resembles what would be known as like a diffeomorphism, where you're remapping the pixels in a certain way in specific, really pooling regions, such that a human observer can't really tell the difference, right? And not all transforms are like this. So not all transforms will yield a result such that if I kind of go back and do this demo once again, you would be fooled, right? And this kind of, again, goes to the concept of metamerism, right? Because you have two physically different stimuli, the unmodified and the modified stimuli, and I'm flipping them back and forth. The X values of both of them, X1 and X2, if you were to represent them as matrices, are fundamentally and physically different. And yet when I run them through a function F, your brain is fooled and you think they're the same thing, right? Noise and perturbations included. So that, I would say, is or has been, you know, defined as a notion of metamerism in auditory perception as well, visual perception. Can you make a metamer out of another transform, Arturo? Like this is a bit too funky, you know. Can I do something as trivial as just changing one pixel here in the top left corner? Yes, you can do that. And yes, that would also count as a metamer. But the question here is that an interesting metamer to study, right? So that's kind of where you see this, and Josh talked about this as well towards the end. This is not an adversarial example. It's almost in a way the opposite, right? It's like it's two physically different stimuli mapping to the same thing versus a stimuli that is perturbed slightly and going in the opposite direction, right? So again, similar but different. So part of the tutorial. So okay, so why does this happen? So there's a phenomenon called crowding, and it's related to texture perception, and it also motivates why we wanted to make a foveated transform that had this type of mechanism. Such that if again I run this demo and you guys fixate at this orange dot, you should perceive that these two textures are pretty much the same, even though the pixel values are different. This is the original texture, and this one has been rendered. And this goes back to the work of Portilla and Simoncelli in the early 2000s or late 90s. So the reason, again, why this happens is if you were to find some sort of function that represents perceptually some stage of the ventral stream, whatever that means, or if that's even possible, because again, this is just a cartoon, and you correctly find that function, and you synthesize an image that, starting from a noise seed, that matches at the end the same function values, you should be able to render a stimuli that is, if your perceptual function F is correct, perceptually indistinguishable for the human observer, or for any model observer, really, right? For some of the experiments that Josh presented in the earlier session, it's great that, you know, you could do this for audition as well, and it works, right? So, and anyway, this has been used in texture synthesis a lot. and is the basis of the Freeman and Simoncelli metamer model from 2011. Actually, we're going to do this for all of those small log polar receptive fields or pooling regions in the visual field. Okay, and if you do that correctly and you match the spectrum, the global spectrum of the image as well to a certain degree, you should be able to render what's known as a metamer. So Freeman and Simoncelli did this and this is their Nature Neuroscience paper. And the problem, even though the images work amazingly well and are beautiful, is that it takes 4 to 6 hours to render one single stimuli. So now we get to the crossroads, as they say in that movie with Al Pacino, right? So we get to the crossroads. You do everything right, you know, but if you want to train a deep net on 1 million of these images, you have to wait 6 million hours, and that's computationally intractable, right? Even if you, whatever, find a way to accelerate this, put this in CUDA, whatever, it would probably still take you about, I don't know, 3 hours, or you'd have a halfway split. So essentially, there's something in the model that has to be algorithmically changed really as well, so that you can efficiently, say, parallelize this, and essentially also just find another way to synthesize this type of stimuli, right? And that's kind of what we try to do, with a future goal of trying to see what emergent properties you can find of training deep nets on these foveated images, which is, let's compute a feed-forward transform that can go from the image to a foveated image and approximate fairly well the Freeman and Simoncelli metamers in just 1 or 2 seconds. And that was like the goal of that project. And in doing so, we also tie some of the principles we use to what's been known in vision science, and also perceptual invariance, I guess you could say. Sorry, vision science and computer vision, touching on some of the ideas in perceptual invariance. So how do we do this? It's like that, the Ocean's 12 scene. The laser field, but before the laser field, what is a metamer? I talked about this again, but I'm going to emphasize it. 2 physically different stimuli that are perceptually indistinguishable to each other. And are these 3 images metamers? 1 and 2, yes. The distortion is different, but they are metamers. 1 and 3, yes. The distortion is different and they are metamers. 2 and 3, I don't know. Presumably they should be. If 1 and 2 and 1 and 3 are metamers, then 2 and 3 by transitivity should also be metamers. So hopefully the answer is yes. You'd have to psychophysically test that, but the answer should be yes if you've done the transforms correctly. Interesting differences also, before I get into the details of the model, is this type of Foveation transform is doing something at the retinal or V1 level, right, with this log polar transform 2 and adaptive Gaussian blurring. And what we want to do is kind of mimic this perceptual invariance really at the stage of V2 that has to do with texture matching and crowding really in the periphery, okay? So that's also one of the main differences between, a lot of people ask questions, why didn't you do this instead? Or are you hiding some results? And say, well, Wang and Cottrell did this before and actually found very similar things. So that's actually pretty good. It's exciting that even if you take these 2 bifurcating approaches, you kind of still get to the same answer. And I think that's very enriching, both for vision science and computer vision. So the laser field, a new metamer rendering pipeline. How do we do this? Before I get into this, actually, I know many of you might have thought when I showed this is, you know, Porti and Simoncelli were doing this in the year 2000. If you render a metamer, you have to use a texture synthesis pipeline from the Porti and Simoncelli model in 2000 that they used 10 years later in 2011. Why don't you use style transfer, which is like the new buzzword of texture synthesis, really, to come up with a new metamer model? And that's pretty much what we did. That's this approach. We do local style transfer for each one of these log polar receptive fields and render a metamer. And that's really the long story short. So I know I just went back. I'm going to go forth again. So I'm going to try to condense this section to get to the second part. But that's pretty much the story. We essentially compress this image and also send in parallel noise seeds through a VGGNet encoder all in the convolutional stage. We're going to stack a peripheral architecture on top that has these log polar receptive fields on top of the last convolutional layer after we throw away the fully connected ones. And then we do adaptive instance normalization, which is a style transfer technique that will impose the style of the original image on the noise. So it's going to texturize the image to its like non-shape like version of itself in some high dimensional space, and we're going to interpolate in that direction. And that's what this looks like. Case study, perceptual invariance, case study. You want to foveate this. plot twist. This is your receptive field. How would you metamerize this receptive field one way or another so that you can fool a human observer? And that's kind of like the way this bottleneck or this module was created. You're going to, again, send this to the VGGNet. And so in some high dimensional encoded space, this is where the image is placed. Then you're going to do the same thing for that noise seed that I showed you guys before that's done in parallel. You're going to do style transfer, so adaptive internormalization from this image on the noise. So you're going to stylize the noise, okay? This is the equivalent of saying I'm going to do, roughly speaking, Portilla and Simoncelli texture synthesis from this white noise seed with this image and come up with this perceptual stimuli. But we're just doing it in another way with a feed-forward transform, pretty much, instead of using gradient descent. And then we're going to walk in this direction in this high-dimensional space, assuming it's a line, which might be incorrect, but we still did it, and we found interesting results. And what we find is that if you carefully find that direction the right way and you go in that line in this high-dimensional space up until a certain degree, some sort of perceptual boundary, the human observer should not be able to tell the difference between this modified image and this one. Very grossly speaking, you know, if this receptive field that has been exaggerated for this demonstration purpose has been placed very far away in the periphery. Okay, so that's really the crux of this model, and doing this for all the small pooling regions in the image. Okay, so we're going to do that operation for all of these pooling regions of receptive fields. And then you're going to send it through a decoder, and then you'll get a metamer. And that's it. It's a feed-forward transform. Next part I'm just going to go through fast because of the benefits of time is then you have to find what is the maximum perturbation coefficient to do this. You have to run some sort of perceptual optimization procedure that I'm going to skip so I can get to the other part, which is part 2, which is a bit more interesting. But long story short, you find the coefficients, and then you bring the human observers in. Perceptual invariance tutorial, okay, human in the loop. How do you know if the human is actually, you know, fooled by this type of distortion? You bring him to the psychophysics room, you have him sit inside a dark room, you know, in a screen, you set the 26-degree of visual angle or whatever for the visual stimuli, and you flip between two images, the unperturbed and the perturbed one. Or you can do what Friedman and Simoncelli did, which is from 2 different noise seeds, render 2 perturbed images and flicker between both. Anyway, if the distortion is not that obvious, you should be doing that around chance and not be able to tell the difference, which is what you would see here. But if the distortion is very, very exaggerated and you say somehow screwed things up and your perceptual function is either wrong or you distorted the image too much, then the human observer should be able to tell the difference, as you guys are telling the difference now, right? And you should be at either perfect or 80% chance or 90 or whatever, and they're not perceptually indistinguishable. The images are not metamers, right? So the interesting thing here is you want to find the sweet spot up until you can find that kind of, I don't know if this, it's not point of selective equality. The point of just noticeable differences just before the human, the system kind of breaks down, they're no longer metamers, right? And then somehow link that to physiology and say, what does this tell us about, say, the human visual system as well, right? For this specific type of distortion too. So anyway, we ran those experiments and correctly calibrated our model and found at the end that the distortions were very similar. I'm gonna skip through this, but the distortions are very similar to the ones created by Friedman and Simoncelli. In fact, if you flicker, just as a demo, between this reference image and this kind of metamer image, a human observer shouldn't be able to tell the difference if you flicker very rapidly between them. But if you flicker, interestingly enough, between these two images, this is another, the second plot twist of perceptual invariance. These images look really nothing like natural scenes. They're very distorted, but yet they're actually different. So if you look here at the tire, for example, they're distorted in the same way, but yet they're actually physically different, and human observers still can't tell the difference between these two. So it also tells you something about, this is kind of a bizarre buzzword, but the perceptual null space of the human observers under certain type of distortions and directions of the distortions as well, right? So anyway, that's end of first part. I'm going to transition to the questions now, just for a bit. So feel free to type some. Before I go to the second part, I have a bit like 25 minutes, which is now what happens if you train the deep nets on these foveated images. What you get, is there something new? Are we rediscovering the wheel or something like that? So, okay, let me just extend this a bit. What time? Okay, last one. Okay, there's 2. So Roger Silva asks, your implementation of Foveation by initial transfer yields no change in architecture. is that a disagreement with the efficiency argument in favor of foveation? I'm gonna try to answer that question at the end, and if I don't get to it, let me know, because I think that's probably going to be answered somewhere towards the end. In the second part. Okay, performance for Glibzarine, again related to part 2. Anthony Chen asks, do you know if people have tried to train networks with foveation transforms with an action space that specifies how to saccade, like it through an RL framework? Actually, there has been work that is, yeah, I'm going to talk about it at the end. There's been work that's learned to do object detection with a foveated transform by my previous lab when I was at UCSB. It's a paper by Akabas and Eckstein that was actually had a very hard time in CVPR, rejected for 3 years, and then finally went through PLOS computational biology. And this was a paper that was on arXiv in 2014. After the boom of deep nets, it kind of just got pushed away. And then finally went through 3 years later, and it's a great paper. I'm gonna talk about it more at the end, and you should definitely see it. Also, interesting thing before I go to the second part is that when thinking about foveation transforms and perceptual invariance in general, you know, in a more serious note, is that the pattern of results that you might find also depends naturally on the nature of the foveation transform, which is very valid. And it also depends on the nature of the images too, right? If you're doing this on scenes, it's likely that the results you'll find will change if you do it on objects, because object perception has been shown to be different than scene recognition or scene perception as well. So there's some differences with that too. I'm going to talk about that at the end too in the second part. But by the way, if someone has questions about the first part about perceptual invariance or metamerism, feel free to also just type that in, and I'll try to answer them at the end. So, all right, I'm going to try to fly in the second part. The second stage, which is now what happens, you know, you have the foveation transform, you want to say force perceptual invariance through foveation inside a deep net or any model system, and just see what happens, and let us actually see what happens when we perceptually evaluate these networks. What happened here? Okay, so perceptual implications of the foveation transform. So what happens if you build perceptual invariance into these deep networks? Okay, so again, here the name of the game is scene categorization, and we have these 4 model systems that I explained, we talked about before, and we would just want to compare them. We just want to see what happens. Does eye movements buy you something? Does augmentation buy you something? Does foveation buy you something? In reference to this kind of control observer that has no foveation at all, right? And again, putting things in perspective with feathers or wings, right? What would it mean? Kind of, I'm bringing out my inner cognitive scientist for this. What would it mean to, or what would we have to find in the pattern of results to say that adding foveation does buy you something versus not adding it at all? You would maybe expect greater performance, more robustness. You would expect similar or better, but if you see something worse for foveation, that's kind of red flag, right? It means that things aren't really going your way for the wing people, and maybe it's more of the feathers thing, right? So what we did is we trained 10 different networks for each one of these model systems from randomly matched noise seeds, and we just let SGD provide all the randomness aside from the augmentation procedure that each one had. And the foveated networks were trained and tested on foveated images, and the non-foveated networks were trained and tested on non-foveated images. And let's see how they perform when doing 20-way scene categorization, trained on 5,000 images per scene, by the way. So about, with a held up training set, about 90,000 images. This is how StandarDNet performs. So about, and these are a subspace of the places data set, by the way. About 65% for each one of these, you know, randomly initialized networks. So, you know, it's a baseline, it's a number, doesn't really mean much. Now, how does it compare to the others? Drum roll. About the same, actually. They're all performing about 62, 63%. Not much difference. Even, again, blue here is foveation and gold is non-foveated. Even and dashed is the augmented variance, by the way. So no clear win for wings. Really, you could say so far as is feathers. So point for the feathers, folks out there. And then we did an interesting contrived task. That is, you would say a bit unusual, but we were curious to see what happened, which is what happens if we show non-foveated images to the foveated networks and flip this, and foveated images to the non-foveated networks. And that's a cross-generalization task, essentially. And we see that the gap or the dip in performance for the standard nets or the non-foveated systems is greater than for the foveated system, which is quite interesting. So
from this, we could kind of, I don't know, conclude or say, go at a hint that networks that are trained or systems that are trained with this spatially varying field of view can have higher levels of out of distribution generalization to a certain degree. The drop here in performance is about 5 to 10% for both the gold plots, and about maybe 1 to 2 or 3% for the networks in blue. And this is kind of the snare, right? Foveated on non-foveated, and non-foveated networks tested at this point for this out of generalization or the cross generalization task on foveated images. So that's interesting result. Again, this is what happens if you kind of force this new type of perceptual invariance borrowed from a human, right? Texture matching that simulates crowding in the periphery, and you force it onto a deep net. Robustness to occlusion. So this is another pretty interesting one. If we occlude the stimuli and kind of emulate glaucoma or scotoma, or show inside out or outside in occlusion to the visual stimuli, what do you find? In the interest of time, I might actually have to skip through this or go through this faster, but interestingly enough, you find almost no difference between blue and gold, so Foveation and standard net, but you find a big gap for the augmented variant of the non-foveated system. The more interesting one really, I think, is the scotoma. And this is the one that actually surprises a lot of people. In the interest of time, not going to run a poll, but this was a pretty counterintuitive result, because if you occlude the stimuli pre-foveation, you find that the system that learns how to see with a foveated field of view is actually more robust to removing the foveal region. Okay, so that is pretty bizarre and pretty counterintuitive. You would imagine that they might have done worse. Okay, so then again, you know, here the interesting thing is, if we're occluding the stimuli here, maybe the foveation transform is doing something that is giving some benefit to the CNN in the later stages. And that's what we examined. Actually, if you see the visual input, so suppose this image of the aquarium, and you run it through the Foveation transform, the crowding mechanism in the nature of the transform actually modifies the occluded area, both for the glaucoma occlusion and the scotoma occlusion, right? For the case where for the networks in gold, so the standard nets, you don't see any modification in the area, which is why they perform about the same. But interestingly enough, if you go look at the scotoma condition where we see this huge bump, we see how it's filling in the area from the outside in somehow, and yet that's potentially what's explaining this huge bump in performance. The other possibility is that the network is learning to capitalize on the texture statistics in the periphery to somehow boost its performance, right? Because the other standard nets have no way to do that, have no way to access that type of information. So how do we test that? We go to the second kind of experiment, which is, let's equalize the occlusion at the post-foveation stage, and let's just see what happens. So this is kind of like saying, let's level the playing ground a bit. We're going to foveate as well, but we're going to kind of equate for the occluded area. So there's no funny business going on anymore, and we actually want to see who the culprit is of the boost in performance, right? And what we find interesting enough is when you equate for the area, the benefit goes away. Right, so even though you think it has to do with the texture statistics in the periphery that are buying you that added benefit, really it has to do from the filling in procedure from the outside in the scotoma, and so the robustness is really coming from the filling in or the crowding like procedure from the outside in, and the foveation process in itself, not what's learned later. Interestingly enough, though, the performance is not such a huge gap. They're doing about the same. There's maybe just like a 5% decrease. And so that's still kind of very interesting. And we see no differences for the glaucoma, by the way. So I'm just going to skip some of these results in the interest of time. But we did a lot of other experiments of just finding if there was a center image bias. And we kind of created these Q-conflicting stimuli kind of inspired by the Gaidos et al. Paper. We said, what happens if we have one image for one scene in the fovea and another one in the periphery? Like, what happens? How's the network bias? And we actually find that networks that are foveated are more biased to center image regions. So the center image class versus the one in the periphery. So a center image bias emerges in foveated nets versus non-foveated nets. Is that feathers or wings? I'm not sure. I think that's really up to debate. That just happens to be an interesting property. And then the other experiment for this small set of experiments is, in trying to answer this question, is what happens if you filter the stimulus, right? I mean, we didn't train with this type of transform that's adaptive Gaussian blurring, and we usually know that they're more sensitive to low spatial frequencies in the periphery and high spatial frequencies in the fovea. So what happens if you kind of do this robustness to or sensitivity to high pass or low pass spatial frequency information? And we actually find somewhat counterintuitively that you're more robust to high spatial frequency, high pass spatial frequency information versus low pass spatial frequency information, likely due to the center image bias, in which the center of the image has been undistorted and it's learned to pick that information up. So it's another, again, is this feathers or is this wings? I don't think you can tell for this specific experiment unless you somehow link this to, say, adversarial robustness. Okay, but again, interesting property. So to kind of sum up some conclusions of the second part before wrapping things up is, eye movements, it didn't seem that it bite us anything really. I'm going to skim through the results again, but if you go through the dashed blue lines, they're almost very similar to the regular blue lines. Let's kind of go back very, very fast. Dashed blue versus blue, they're almost superimposing for almost all the experiments actually, even these as well. So why is that? That's kind of puzzling. But if you put things in perspective, really eye movements in the literature of scene perception, it kind of really makes sense. They shouldn't be buying you much. Maybe for object recognition, it would be a different story. Interestingly enough, there are greater differences between centered net and centered net, and why it's likely due because of the resizing, and you would think that data augmentation is a good thing, and in this case, we actually found that it actually isn't. If you go back to the plots, feel free to take your time doing that. Later revisiting the talk, the dashed gold curve is actually always lower than the regular gold curve. So that's kind of puzzling too. And an interesting future direction for those of you in the ice cream business, the scooping business, scenes versus objects. I think this is a great direction because it's likely due that if you were to rerun the same model on objects, you would potentially find a different story. And we have a hunch, an idea that it's possible that foveation with this type of texture-driven distortion is implicitly going to give you a natural way of giving you a shape bias for object recognition. Because, for those of you who are, I'm sure everyone is at this point familiar with the Gayos et al. Paper, it's artificial to do style transfer from art on a bunch of random images and come up with a shape bias. But if you foveate, have these texture-driven distortions, learn from that procedure, and then somehow retest the same experiments, you should find that foveation does buy you some sort of natural type of shape bias. And I mean, the hint for that is already here kind of, because shape bias is usually correlated with high pass spatial frequency bias. So somewhat, we talk about this in our NeurIP submission, and I'd encourage anyone else who has more questions to read the paper too. So the code is available online as well. We're moving it to PyTorch. Right now it's in Lua. Perspectives and new directions, and trying to answer the last question about foveation trained in humans and machines. Or evaluated in humans and then tested on machines. This was a paper by Akbas and Eckstein. There's been these type of research directions have been explored for a while, more than 10 years, or well within the last decade actually, but they've been there for a while. This paper, for example, is trying to explore foveation and its relationship to adversarial images. Work by Xavi Boix, also from the Pogio lab. Work by Pramod and from the Kanemacher lab, an underrated paper that had to do with foveation with adaptive Gaussian blurring, that it might buy you greater performance for object recognition. And there's been many works by the guys at Facebook Reality Labs, Deep Phobia, Wayne Cottrell, Ruth Rosenholz, Ching-Wise and Olhausen. Recent work also by the Pogio lab with Andy Banbursky on foveation and eye movements for robustness to adversarial images. So work by Yana Hang also on foveation via adaptive Gaussian blurring, how it's almost isomorphic to buying you scale invariance. Also very interesting ideas. Work by Geiser and Perry as well. Foveated convolutions by Harris, Niranjan, and Hare. So foveation has been around for a while, and we're excited to see how links to foveation and perceptual invariance can somehow then teach us something new about perception, both in humans and machines, in a somewhat of a symbiotic way. Some current directions are using foveation and metamers specifically as a robustness mechanism for adversarial examples. And this is co-work with Andy Banbursky, right now sponsored by Lockheed Martin. Foveated pooling has been, this is just one paper, but this paper was inspired by many of the previous works that have been happening, and they're things like foveated or spatially varying pooling never really caught up in deep learning, and maybe they should, you know, to explore interesting other applications for even more fancy architectures and CNNs. And then of course you could also think about stuff such as what happens if you train these deep nets with perceptual invariance mechanisms such as foveation. But the other side of the story is what happens if you train an RL agent with this, right? What happens if you have a drone do these type of things and see with a foveated visual system? Can it be more stabilized? Can it be more stable when it explores the environment? And these are things and directions that we're currently exploring, both with the two stellar MIT reps, Ronald Alvarez and Elian Malkin. And feel free to ask me any questions as well about this too. So to wrap things up, feathers versus wings. Still not sure if foveation or perceptual invariance is. Hopefully I've persuaded one side of the crowd to rethink their posture, and just kind of at least get people thinking. I think it's a very interesting question. This workshop was the first where Bill Freeman actually introduced this idea and this kind of almost joke, and it actually set the tone for the entire workshop and the motivation of this workshop. And we have another edition of this workshop, 2020. Everyone, you're please more than welcome and encouraged to submit workshop papers to this. It's a NeurIPS workshop, sponsored also by CBMM in partnership with Princeton. And we're going to be sending a call for papers soon, and we're really excited to see new ideas that people like you, the attendees, might have with respect to many of these ideas that have been talked not only in this tutorial but the entire workshop really, and the entire summer school. And I think it's very relevant, and you guys would find interesting. The talks for the previous years are also available online. So with that being said, I'd like to thank collaborators as well, folks at MIT. And I'd be more than happy to answer any questions, I think, at this point. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So thank you. Let's see. I'm going to try to answer a question. Okay, AJ and R asks, why do you prefer Lua over PyTorch to start with? That's a great question. So let me go back to that slide. So, well, this was because we did the first paper we started in 2017, and there was no PyTorch at that point actually. So we used the adaptive instance normalization code that was in Lua, modified it, and kept it in Lua, and just used that Lua code, and it worked well so far. Now we're actually moving it to PyTorch so that people can use it, and it should yield the same results, and it should. And we'll be posting the PyTorch code online because we want people to use this as well. Lua at the time was fast. It was just available, mainly that. But yeah, and if someone also has an implementation of this, please let me know in TensorFlow or PyTorch, because I think that it's been postponed for so long that I wish people could also use it and build upon this work too to test other interesting hypotheses and ideas. Waja Visel asks, hasn't region-based proposal networks already defeated the advantage that Foveation might have provided for object detection tasks? Isn't it much more plausible for object detection? That's a great question. So, and maybe I'm going to transition to this slide because it kind of talks about that. So I think, yeah, that question is very related to these two, from Akbaz and Eksan and Pramod Kidinarun. So I think there's two sides to the question, which is, first is, do you want foveation as a mechanism that is, say, like the new nonlinearity that every single model has to have foveation and it's the next big thing in computer vision? I'm not sure if the answer there is yes, because presumably there's many roads that kind of take you to Rome, right? Classic example is many people would argue that, Arturo, you don't really need between Jim and Josh throughout this summer school, there's been this debate about you need recursion, somewhere in deepness. But I mean, I think all of us are pretty surprised if we look a couple of years back on how just using convolution, ReLU, and pooling, you can actually do pretty amazing things and you don't even need recursion, and somehow you can solve many of the tasks that we thought were impossible to do without recursion, right? So I don't know if you would necessarily need foveation to supplant kind of like a faster RCNN bounding box kind of detection mechanism first that gives you the region proposals, and then somehow you do the object recognition pipeline. I don't know. At the end, they might be two different paths to take you to the same level of perceptual accuracy. But then there's other interesting questions such as, you know, computer vision systems still are, you know, very delicate to adversarial images, right? And that's a really big problem that hasn't been solved yet. In fact, as a bit of a controversial opinion, I'd argue that adversarial images is, you know, not just probably one of the most important problems in current machine learning or computer vision, but probably vision science. I feel like, and I'm stepping aside from the whole theme of perceptual invariance and metamers and foveation and vision, but I think, you know, if you go back to how advances in vision have happened over the years, over the past maybe 50 years or 60, you know, there's discoveries that have been made from single cell electrophysiology, for example, you know, Hublin Weasel, or, you know, recordings from cat striate cortex, experiments by Kufler on retinal ganglion cells as well. And, you know, then there was fMRI, and all these tools kind of came up and showed you a different answer that has to do with the human visual system. And, you know, then came EEG, MEG, also eye tracking, and they answer different questions. And I think now we're in this interesting time in history where it's possible that the next breakthrough in vision science will, you know, not maybe not even come from psychologists really, but from people with interdisciplinary backgrounds. And, you know, a phenomenon like adversarial images, I think, is one of the most interesting problems in vision science, I'd even say, right? Because sure, the model observer is a machine, not a human, but as Josh already explored with some of the work done by Janelle Feather, you know, finding how model observers or systems are convergent and divergent between each other teaches you so much about the architectural constraints and mechanisms that they have, so that you can, you know, build the next type of say, you know, high level AI agent that can learn how to see. And then when you do that successfully, so suppose solving adversarial images, solving whatever that mean, which is likely to be aligning the adversarial images with something like these, you know, visual metamers and crowding like distortions, will probably implicitly buy you a higher level of a better AI agent, and also will teach you something about the human visual system or vision systems in general from different model organisms. And I think that's like another separate question that I think is also very interesting. The delicacy of the adversarial example is essentially inherent to the basic, is what I don't understand if the question was fully formed, but I think maybe what you're trying to say is there will always be adversarial examples. Yeah, that's probably true. And I think there's been some theoretical work in machine learning that's argued that. I think here the main interesting point is, could you find a way in which you can align adversarial examples of machines with humans? And what does that tell you about this new model that maybe has a new architectural constraint that you want to poke in and find in vision in humans or other model organisms, right? Suppose maybe foveation is bias you robustness adversarial examples, hence proving foveation is wings and not feathers, right? Maybe divisive normalization bias you robustness to adversarial examples, and then you hence prove that it's wings and not feathers, and that it's very useful as a canonical computation in advanced level vision. So there's many type of ways in which you can use this kind of you know, weakness really of perceptual systems to try to see what's missing in the whole landscape of human visual perception and visual perception in general of different model organisms. I think that's pretty much it. There's this one last question, I think, by Roger that he asked that I didn't, I think, answer at the beginning, which was, your implementation of foveation by initial transform yields no change in architecture. That's correct. Is that a disagreement with the efficiency argument in favor of foveation? Really, the way we're thinking about, if we go back to this part, is this is just like a scheme of a high-level scheme of saying, let's just kind of, even if we have the same architecture for the foveation transform, where here we're not perturbing the image at all, and here we are, we're just curious on saying, does it later lead to any sort of consequences when you match both of the architectures? It might be an unfair advantage to have one specific architecture that's doing better for foveation and one that's doing worse for center on it. Or say here, if we had a bifurcating one, and here if we had one that wasn't, right? People could always argue, oh, you're doing better just because the network is bifurcated and here it's not. So we wanted to try to, thinking along the lines of a psychologist, kind of match all the conditions, have everything highly controlled, and just change one small thing, which would be something like the Foveation transform here, for example. So yeah,